Valera smelled of salt and light. The air itself seemed to hum when Salana stepped off the landing ramp. Her boots sank into a carpet of filaments that glowed faintly beneath her weight, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Above them, the trees wore lanterns, blooming orbs of soft blue that opened and closed in time with some unseen tide. She had read every spectrograph, every soil sample before she came. None of it prepared her for the small, attentive wonder of being inside the planet's slow breath. Jack stood a little behind her, hands in his jacket pockets, jaw tight. He watched the way she moved through the glow, the way her fingers reached for a hanging petal and brought it close to her face, as if making acquaintance with a person. They were a team in official reports: Salana, lead xenobiologist; Jack, mission systems engineer. They were something else in quieter records: a year shared between starports and labs, a relationship that ended in the cramped privacy of a shuttle bay, and a promise that had never quite healed either of them. She didn't look back. Not yet. There was work to be done. There were patterns of light to map and an energy pulse to follow. Valera's waves had been intermittent, a slow, clean beat that migrated across the southeast basin. The mission had a single order: observe, document, avoid interference. Salana had sworn those words every morning for months. She swore them again now, not because she disagreed, but because rules could be maps, and maps were made for navigating, sometimes away, sometimes toward. They followed the current of glow through a grove whose trunks were translucent, vein-filled columns that hummed under their hands. Small animals, if they were animals, moved like stitches of starlight between roots. Salana's tablet chattered quietly. Jack checked its readouts with professional caution, correcting a coordinate here, adjusting a sensor there. He kept his voice soft. He kept near. The pulse led them to a cliff face, its mouth a jagged seam until they stepped into her light. A cave like a throat, lined in ribboned lumens, breathed a scent of mineral and flowering sap. From within, a band of energy washed out and back, patient and warm. They did not expect to find anything conscious, but Valera rarely followed expectation. When the form came out, it moved like a poem written in slow water. Nearth stepped from the cave not as a single body, but as a sequence of light, limbs of pale blue that folded and extended with careful deliberation. He was tall enough that his head brushed the low branches. The lines of his frame glowed with intricate filigree, like constellations stitched along skin. The pattern shifted as if reading them was itself a dialogue. He did not speak aloud. Salana felt words press against the inside of her chest, as if the air itself could translate thought into sensation. Welcome, curiosity, watchful memory.
Her instruments registered a complex harmonic, an infrasonic chord threaded with the planet's baseline hum. Jack tightened his hold on the sensor pack at his hip. There were chemical signatures in Nearth's shimmer they did not understand. There was something else, too, a readiness that kept him careful, as if Nearth was as much guardian as a creature. Salana stepped forward. It was what she had come for. She extended a gloved hand, not out of bravado, but out of precise, deliberate curiosity, the same motion that had unraveled 1,000 hypotheses into new questions. Nearth inclined his head and offered the inside of his forearm. The blue patterns there were thinner, more concentrated, like the lacing on a seed pod. When her fingers brushed the light, the contact was not electrical in the way she had feared. It was a compression of time and attention, as if some slow clock had been wound and its hands touched her skin. Warmth moved through her like a surge of memory that did not belong to her. She smelled rain on an ocean she'd never seen. She tasted minerals sung from heated stone. Her heartbeat dropped, then matched something lower and grander beneath the planet's hum. Jack flinched, but he did not pull her back. He reached instead for a protocol, an arm between them, a scanner extended. Nearth did not recoil. He lowered his hand until their palms almost met, and then withdrew, allowing Salana the trace of connection, but not the full exposure. The alien's light wove a single line that wrapped around her wrist like the gesture of a looped thread. Not a chain, not a possession, a line. The instruments recorded the event as an energy coupling, stable, bidirectional, and unmistakably mutual. For the rest of that first afternoon, Salana cataloged instead of naming. She pressed sensors to Nearth's forearm and listened to the tide in his veins of light. Nearth responded by guiding them down into the cave, where roots unspooled into patterns under a blue floor. He pointed, if pointing can be made of bloom and suggestion, toward formations that fed the planet's pulse, siphon nodes, radiating petals whose bioluminescence was animated by subterranean currents. Jack watched her learn. He watched the ease of it, the way Salana translated a shimmer into a hypothesis with a quick, excited breath, and his chest tightened with something that felt like guilt folded into ache. He told himself he was proud. He told himself he had wanted this for her. Yet every time she laughed softly at a fact she had pieced from light, the space between them rearranged itself, and he was standing at the margin. Over the following days, they settled into a rhythm filigreed with wonder. Salana and Nirth moved like two hands learning a new phrase of sign language. Nirth gave her gestures of the planet. He pressed his palm to a cluster of glowing fungi, and the spores rose, wreathing her in vapor that tasted faintly of citrus and iron.
Salana returned the gift by placing a cool, engineered crystal on Nirth's skin, a test piece that hummed when touched. Together they sang the crystal's tone, observing how it altered Nirth's patterning, how a human-made frequency translated into a new bloom of light. They exchanged flowers, literal and not. Nirth presented her with a crown of filament that dissolved into a flurry of motes when she tucked it behind her ear. In return, Salana taught him the art of making a map on the ground, drawing routes with charcoal dust that Nirth watched with intent fascination. Nights were spent under Valera's 2 moons, one pale, one a cold blue that lent depth to the glow, while the trio sat at the threshold of the cave and compared the languages of their worlds: ink marks, light pulses, breath. Salana learned to listen to silence as much as to signals. Jack tried to participate. He installed sensors at Nirth's repressed, delicate, precise arrays that picked up the invisible harmonics the alien used when he shifted his hue. He offered technical explanations that bridged human instruments and Valera's peculiar physiology. He joked sometimes, a way to thread himself into moments that felt otherwise complete without him. Salana thanked him freely. Nirth matched. Sometimes he mirrored Jack's small worry lines with a slow contraction of blue bands. And still, the wideness between them kept growing like a tide measuring shore. It was not Salana's intention to exclude him. She had not set out to find solace in light rather than skin. She had never wanted the awkwardness that trailed their conversations like a shadow. But wonder is a centripetal force. It drew her wholly. Jack's hands began to find the edges of the mission's rulebook. He rechecked communications for anomalies. He patched their profiles to mission logs. He read old messages from their time together and cataloged them with clinical care until they became data points, flat, analyzable, heartless. Once, when Nirth taught Salana how to coax a bloom to sing by tapping its base, Jack's fingers hovered near the plant. Salana helped him find the rhythm. He laughed then, genuine and rueful, and the sound cracked something in his chest that had been smooth with denial. He loved her. This was never a secret. He loved her as a thing that slid between his ribs like a small, sharp stone. He loved her enough to want to be the one to keep her safe if the planet turned. But the planet did not yield to possession. Valera returned each earnest human effort with a softer, stranger response. A canopy shimmer that read like a story, a current that altered a map, an insect that moved the light in a new key. Salana was not taken over. She was invited to listen deeper. Nirth's gestures became more intimate in a way that had nothing to do with arms, a pulse that matched Salana's breath. When she lay back on the moss and let the glow wash over her, Jack saw the way her face softened, the way her guard lowered.
He stood there on the fringe, the warmth in his throat turning acidic. On the 5th night, they found the grove that the locals had called a heart when they learned to translate the planet's gestures. It was a low basin, ringed with roots that lifted like ribs, and in the middle a standing stone that pulsed in slow cadences. The blue moon hung near vertical. Its light was such that shadows appeared as negatives of glow. Nirth had led them there, gently, as if obeying a liturgical route. Salana sat on a root and closed her eyes. The planet's chorus swelled around them, not loud but impossible to ignore. She could feel a map unspooling across her skin, pathways hidden beneath the surface, a lattice of energy that threaded Valera like a circulatory system. She had questions that mattered for the mission: isotopic flows, regenerative patterns, whether the planet's glow could be adapted to human use without destroying it. She had other questions as well. Where did this connection end? How far could a human mind go within the planet's memory? Who was Nirth inside that luminous body, beyond the role of guardian? Jack sat opposite her. technically within reach but emotionally remote. He watched the way Nearth crouched, not because he feared, but because he could feel an alliance forming between the alien and Salana, in movements that were not mechanical but instinctual. The tension lodged in Jack hardened into something dangerous that had two sides, a protective instinct and a selfish panic that if he did nothing, a part of Salana would be carried away into a light he could not follow. He had not always been this brittle. There were nights when he had promised to go anywhere with her. There were mornings when their hands were warm in the dark. But those promises had been forged in the narrower world of human circuits and contained expectations. Valera did not keep to those circuits. It rewrote them. "What if we record deeper?" Salana asked, eyes closed, voice a small sound in the huge basin. "What if we peer into the strata beneath? We could learn so much if we coordinate the sensors." Nearth's light flickered in answer. It was not yes or no. It was a question folded with an offering. Care will be required. The planet's deeper layers were not empty. They were memory, compost, the slow accrual of ages. To go deeper would be to poke at that memory. Jack's hand tightened on his tablet. "We have limits," he said. His voice cracked a little on the last word, betraying the angle beneath his caution. Fear disguised as protocol. Salana opened her eyes. She looked at him then, and there was no pity in the way she saw him. There was only the hard brightness of someone who had chosen exploration as a way of life. "Limits keep us safe," she said, "but limits also keep us from knowing." Her fingers brushed a luminous vine, and the light there rose up like a question mark. "We can be careful." He wanted to argue the point.
He wanted to call command and run the whole thing past people who wore badges and had the neat answers. The idea of a human committee deciding in a room light years away steadied him like a wall. Instead, Jack said nothing at first. He watched Salana's mouth when she smiled at Nearth. He watched him, the way the alien reached out, not to take, but to mirror. In that silvered moment, Jack felt something that was more fear than anger, the panic of being left without a story to hold on to. "That's it," Salana whispered, as if naming the seam she wanted to slip into. Her breath fogged the edge of the air. Nearth leaned closer, his filigree brightening in tiny waves, and the root they sat upon thrummed under them like a response. She lifted her hand. There was deliberation in the movement, a scientist weighing probabilities, and a human weighing possibility. "Go deeper," she added aloud, the syllables soft but clean as a bell. The phrase left her mouth like a key. "That's it. Go deeper," she said. Then the giant alien did something shocking. It began as a bloom of light at Nearth's core. At first it seemed merely larger than usual, a lenticular pulse that expanded outward through him like breath. Then the change accelerated. His body unfurled and elongated in a way that was both graceful and impossible. Limbs stretched like ink spilled on cloth, branching into spines that lifted and arched. The filigree lines on his skin multiplied, fusing into arcs that coalesced into a vast translucent surface. The grove's small lanterns flared and dimmed in answer. Roots trembled and unrooted themselves gently, responding to the motion. The air cooled as if a large body had shifted into the atmosphere. A wind, an exhale of planet and guardian, rose, carrying with it the scent of deep caves and iron rain. The canopy above them, stimulated by the shifting harmonics, brightened and then bent toward Nearth's new shape as if drawn by a magnet. Roots rose from the basin and intertwined around his expanding form, wrapping like threads into a dome. It was neither a cage nor a shell, but a woven amplification, light concentric and layered, each filament humming with the planet's memory. Salana felt the motion as a pressure and as an invitation. The line that had once encircled her wrist pulsed and widened until it was a cloak that settled over her shoulders. It did not feel binding. It felt like a promise. The world around her rearranged itself into deep tiers. Above, the familiar grove. Beneath, a sudden visibility of strata, veins of sediment, seams of older growth, unfolding like pages. The ground beneath their feet opened into a stair that dove into luminous depths, each step glowing with the history of the planet. Jack's breath caught. He had expected an image, a flash, perhaps a data-rich projection. He had not expected scale. Nearth's transformation made him small in a new way. The alien was not monstrous.
He was more immense than he had been, an architecture of light that articulated the planet's will to shelter and to teach. The dome rose like a cathedral of living lass, and the sound inside it was not noise, but a chorus of remembered seasons. For a few suspended seconds, the three of them, human, guardian, stood under a new sky of light. Salana's head tilted back and she laughed, a pure sound, bright with the knowledge of being in the precise place she had always wanted to be. The cloak of light around her hummed against her spine, and a cascade of images washed across her mind. a tide of migration that had left marks on the stone 1,000 years ago, the slow mending of a wound in the planet's crust, a layered photo of a world learning its boundaries and redrawing them. It was not her memory. It was not Nurth's in the sense of personal biography. It was a planetary ledger offered to a human who had asked to see deeper. Jack felt something crack within him. Not anger exactly, not yet. It was quieter and far more dangerous, a fissure of loss. He had thought his protestations about limits were about ethics. They had not been. They had been about him. The sight of Salana wrapped in that living light, laughing with something that was neither human nor alien but both, made old griefs reopen. The afternoons left unsaid, the nights when promises were deferred for missions and measurements. He imagined a horizon where she would choose that light over him, without thinking of the man who had once warmed her in the dark. He moved forward then, not to touch Nurth, but to stand at the edge of the stairway that descended into the planet's unda-memories. "Sel," he said, voice warped with a tremor. She turned and smiled at him, as if acknowledging the old shape of their affection, while choosing the new pattern that had arrived between them. He tried to say something civil, something practical. "We should," he began. There were commands that could be sent, protocols preserved for human safety. He could call the mission. He could document this and create a barrier. He tasted the authority like a tool to be used. Instead, the words stuck in his throat. He watched Nurth look at him with a band of light that simplified into a pulse of attention, an offer and a question, ancient and patient. Jack felt the weight of two worlds pressing at once, the human one that prized caution, the alien one that offered wonder. He heard an echo in his mind of someone he used to be, who had loved exploration only insofar as it widened a path for both of them. He thought of a future where he would be the one to step back and watch, while she walked toward a door he could not open. Once, long before Valera, he would have handed her his hand without question. Now his hand closed on his sleeve with a small, secret force. The expansion withdrew as slowly as it had begun. Nurth contracted into the shape he had earlier occupied, tall, luminous, but no longer colossal. The dome of roots folded itself back into the floor, leaving a faint shimmer like a scar in the grove. The stairway's glow retreated, but the stair itself remained, a visible seam that had not been there before. The cloak of light lingered on Salana's shoulders for a long beat, and then dissipated into motes that rose and faded like the last sigh of a tale. Salana stared at the stair as if it were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Her eyes were wet, though she did not know whether from the revelation or from the release of something she'd carried for too long. She met Jack's gaze, and in that look there were 1,000 small intelligences exchanged: regret, hope, fear. For a moment they were the two people they had been before Valera invaded the spaces between them: young, daring, imperfect. Nurth's filigree pulsed with a soft ripple, contentment perhaps, or merely the planet's satisfaction at being understood on a level deeper than scrape and data. He did not speak. That did not reduce the enormity of what he had shown them. If anything, his silence made it imperative that they decide, in their own languages, what would come next. Jack stepped backward from the stairway, as if the planet itself had boundaries that he could not cross without losing himself. For Jack, those boundaries were not merely scientific, they were personal. The stair to the planet's memory felt to him like an opening into a place where Salana might remain long after humans had left. He closed his hand into a fist, and inside it formed the architecture of a plan. He did not yet name the plan, but it contained elements that frightened him. A relay to command that could elevate what they'd seen into policy. A signal that could be used to isolate Nurth's influence. A small, surgically precise interference that would prevent any further unmediated merging of human mind and Valeran stratigraphy. It would be justified by risk assessments and covenants, by moral necessity, but inside its bones would be the private thing, the quiet attempt to keep her within the orbit of his love. He was not a villain in that instant. He was a frightened man who had found the world changing around him and had not the vocabulary to speak the change. The first move towards his plan felt, to his rational mind, necessary. To his heart, it felt like theft. Salana rose from the root and touched the stair as a scientist touches an unknown specimen, gently, inquisitively. Her hand hovered over the glowing step, and the motes spun faster around her fingers as if amused. She felt no compulsion to plunge headfirst. She felt an ethical caution as well as curiosity. "We need to mark this," she said finally, voice steady. "We need to document and protect it, and we need to decide together what deeper means." Jack's relief was tiny and immediate, like rain on parched ground. He exhaled as if the weight of his plan were dissolving, but the shadows in his eyes remained. He would press for protocol.
He would find allies where he could. He would watch the way the light lingered in Salana's speech, and keep a ledger of things he feared to lose. Nirth watched both of them with a glow that suggested comprehension beyond their lines of argument. He lowered his head in a slow bow, and the filigree around his eyes folded into patterns that looked like the planet's long-term calendar. There was no triumph in his motion, only a sober acceptance of consequence. They spent the following hours sketching maps, taking samples from the stair's edges, and recording the notes of Nirth's modulation. The data was rich. It would take months, maybe years to parse. Command would want to know. So would universities and corporate sponsors, and 1,000 ambitious hands that, once untethered, could never be entirely called back. When they finally set up base for the night, the camp lights were modest against Valera's own loom. Salana lay on her cot and thought of the stair and the way the planet had unfurled like an answer. She felt small and enormous at once, like someone who had walked into the center of a cathedral and been given a moment alone with the altar. She could imagine the future that might be built from this. New energy systems that learned from Valera's balance rather than ripping it out. Symbiotic research that kept the planet intact. She could imagine also the hunger that real power induced in human hearts. She thought of Jack, and her chest ached with the complexity of affection that did not erase duty. Jack lingered outside her tent. His hands had not been idle. He had laid out probes and back doors in his mind. He had not sent them yet. For a long time he watched the way the light on Salana's face shifted as she slept, because even in that quiet he felt the outline of a life he had wanted. He did the thing he could not do. He drafted a message to Mission Command, a careful, dispassionate note that would make the world aware of the stair. It included safety clauses and risk matrices. It withheld none of what he had seen, but the tone was clinical. He could justify it then. He would be alerting others to a scientific milestone. He would also be building a firewall. It was the closest he could come to protecting what he could not guard with his arms. As he had said, a small wave of light passed across the camp, Nirth's way of closing the day's conversation. The transmission moved across the valley and up the network like a whisper. Jack's throat constricted. He told himself he was doing the right thing. He told himself he would stand by Salana's choice, whatever it was. But the plan settled inside him like a stone that had to be swallowed to return to sleep. Their world had shifted. A stair had been opened. The planet had offered its ledger. Nirth's act had been both revelation and rupture. It had given Salana the deepest kind of data, and Jack the most human of fears.
The mission's rules had not been broken. Rather, they had been given a new definition by the living geography of Valera. Ethics, science, love, all of it now traded in the currency of decisions that could not be easily reversed. In the days that followed, the grove became a locus. Researchers from their small team came and took careful notes. Salana resisted the rush to systematize the stair into mere lines on a map. She argued for slow study and for protocols that honored the planet's rhythms. Jack argued too, but with a hardness that showed where his underlying fear lived. He advocated firmer measures, insists on quarantine zones, on codified human oversight. The words were reasonable enough, but under them he nursed his private calculation. If others did not impose limits, he would have to. Salana continued to spend time with Nirth. That connection remained consensual, both in the technical sense, documentation showed active, reversible coupling, and in a deeper way, Salana chose to be there, to return, to engage. She maintained her agency. She was not consumed. She was transformed by learning. And Jack, watching, began to move beyond fear and toward action, not because he had become cruel, but because grief had a way of sharpening the mind into nested strategies. He would not be a silent husband of possibilities. He would not lose her to a stair without a fight. He did not yet know how far he would go. He only knew that after the expansion, nothing could be undecided. The stair still glowed faint beneath the basin, like a wound that had healed over but left a scar. The planet had given them a door. Now the human imprints on that door began to form. Policies, fears, alliances, and choices. Valera hummed on, indifferent to human debates.
Its slow, luminous breath filled caves and mapped currents. Nirth walked among the trees, guardian and guide. Salana drafted careful notes and touched the stair with reverence. Jack drafted precautions and wrapped his fear in rationality. None of them had ultimate answers. The only certainty was that something had changed, and that change would ripple outward in ways neither